I have just the craziest story. And this one is related to two diseases that seem to have absolutely nothing in common, yet they are so interconnected and intertwined. If you want to learn what those diseases are, stick around for this episode of MysterE. I am MysterE, and this is us exploring all things mysterious in the world of psychology. So if you stuck around through that part, this is going to be all about schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease. Now, I'm not going to go into a great deal about what schizophrenia is. So if you know, you know. If you don't, I would recommend going back to maybe episode 12 and 13 to learn more about an overview of schizophrenia and some of the environmental factors that can cause schizophrenia. But that might be helpful, but it's not totally necessary as long as you have a little bit of an understanding. So this is about schizophrenia and Parkinson's and how they are intertwined. It is crazy to me to think in our world in which we live, we have somebody who is a schizophrenic, and we oftentimes call them crazy or like nuts or whatever. And there is kind of oftentimes a stigma to it, right? But then we see somebody with Parkinson's disease, and we see physical manifestations of a disease. We have the hand shakes, the head shakes, or in some people's cases, we have the blank stares and the frozenness, like somebody like Muhammad Ali. And we have such a different view of those two diseases. It's gotten a lot better, but it's still there. That stigma is still there. I think if people knew how interconnected these diseases are, I think we might be able to break through that wall, that stereotype, that stigma that people with schizophrenia are crazy, that it's a mental weakness, that sort of thing. And so that's what this episode is all about. I'm going to share with you that connection. So we have two major types of activities that are occurring in our brain and throughout our nervous system, throughout our brain and our body, wherever we have neurons or brain cells or nerve cells. Those two types of activities are electrical activity and chemical activity. The electrical activity, that occurs in a part of the neuron called the axon. We're not going to go into detail with that. We'll save that for another episode. We're going to talk about the chemical activity. The chemical activity occurs between two neurons. If you've seen other episodes, you know two neurons are connected via a space, a synapse, where chemicals travel between them. And what happens is a chemical will transfer from one neuron to another, and it'll attach to that other neuron. And that other neuron has these things called receptors. You know, something that is a receptor receives things. They receive this chemical message. We have a bunch of these chemicals in our brains and throughout our nervous system. Those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Neuro being brain, nervous system, messenger being messengers, right? So brain messengers, okay? Nervous system messages. Those neurotransmitters all do a bunch of different jobs for us. They do things like helping us sleep, helping us eat. They help us with emotion, with mood. They help us with physical movement. They help us with learning. They help us with arousal. They help us to speed up our brain. They help us to slow down our brain. And that's just a few of the things these neurotransmitters do. Parkinson's and schizophrenia, they are connected by one neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is dopamine. You might have heard of dopamine before. Dopamine, we talked about it in our social media deal. Dopamine gives us a flood of positive emotions oftentimes. But when dopamine isn't functioning properly, we can end up with different issues, specifically schizophrenia or Parkinson's. This is the difference between schizophrenia and Parkinson's. Schizophrenia is caused by, it's not too much dopamine, it's too many receptors, too many locations where dopamine can latch onto. But for all intents and purposes, we'll just say too much dopamine. So schizophrenia is caused by too much dopamine, right? Too much dopamine leads to those symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, flat affect, which is emotionless types of behaviors. Okay. Parkinson's is caused by too little dopamine. It's caused by a destruction of neurons that make dopamine that are involved with physical movement. Thus, the shaking of the hands, thus, the blank stares, where mentally they could be completely okay. Now, just so you know, there are a couple different types of Parkinson's. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do need to let you know there's Parkinson's that's much more active in the brain, and then there's Parkinson's that's much more active in the body, but we're not going to go into detail with that. But that's just for your, just if you know a lot about Parkinson's, just know that we just don't have time to touch on that. So when you have these two disorders, you have schizophrenia, which is caused by this dopamine hypothesis, which means there are too many receptors. So dopamine is too active. It latches on the receptors and it creates these symptoms, right? And then for Parkinson's disease, you have too little dopamine caused by the destruction of these neurons that make dopamine. In both cases, these diseases are caused by dopamine, yet they have such drastically different symptoms, okay? Now, I want to talk a little bit about how these diseases are treated and how they overlap. So schizophrenia, my aunt is a schizophrenic. Another one was a schizophrenic, and she was on schizophrenia medication for most of her life. Those are called antipsychotic medications, which means they block these receptor sites and it slows down the function of dopamine, helping to curb her hallucinations, delusions, and adding a little bit of emotion to her life. But long-term use of these medications causes symptoms. Can you guess what those symptoms are? They are symptoms that are similar to Parkinson's, shaking. Scientists call it tardive dyskinesia. And that shaking is not Parkinson's, but it's caused by the depletion of dopamine due to long-term use of antipsychotics, which decreases the function of dopamine. Okay. With Parkinson's medication, if you've ever wondered, hey, not enough dopamine, let's give people dopamine. Dopamine is involved with so many different human behaviors that if you give people synthetic dopamine, which is called L-Dopa, it can cause all sorts of different side effects, including, you guessed it, hallucinations, delusions, and flat affect or emotionless. So when these folks are being treated for one or the other, if the medication, they've been on it too long, or if it isn't working well enough, they can actually show signs and symptoms of the other disease. The last thing I want to leave you with, I love movies. I love movies that are based off of true stories. One of my favorite movies of all time, this is a top 5 movie. It is called Awakenings. It is from 1995. It is an Oscar-nominated movie. It has 2 of the greatest actors of all time in my world, Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. And it is all about these patients who have Parkinsonian-like symptoms and are giving a synthetic dopamine to try to wake them up. This movie is incredible. And the acting is amazing, but the portrayal of the science, both good and bad, is an incredible story. So Awakenings, 1995, Robin Williams, Robert De Niro. I highly recommend it. And it'll give you a summary of everything that we just talked about. All right. That's it for me today. I am Mr. E. This is MysterE's Mysteries. I want to just thank you for joining us. for all of our episodes. If you're just tuning in, make sure you go back and check out some other ones. We have a lot of fun. We learn a lot of things. Make sure you 5-star us. Make sure, hey, leave a comment. Let us know if you have a relative with Parkinson's or schizophrenia. Tell us your story. Okay, we'd love to hear from you. A big thank you to Unify Agency and Bear Wade for everything that he does for us. He is simply the best. Hey, I want to thank you for joining us today. Take care.